Welcome to history's dark mirror. Dim the lights, put your headphones on, and prepare yourself. What you're about to hear is not fiction. These are true accounts from the Appalachian Mountains. Stories that have lingered in the shadows for decades, whispered in isolated hollows and forgotten roads. Each tale is a journey into the dark underbelly of human behavior and the unknown that still haunts these ancient ridges. Before we begin, know these stories are not for the faint of heart. Viewer discretion is advised. The air here is thick with mist, the kind that seems to breathe alongside you, pressing cold fingers across the back of your neck as if the mountains themselves are listening. The first story takes us to a remote stretch of the Smoky Mountains, where a group of friends seeking solitude found something far darker than they could imagine. It was mid-August, the heat lingering in the air during the day but giving way to eerie chills after sundown. My name is Elliot, and at the time I was part of a small circle who believed the mountains offered peace. We weren't prepared for what we encountered. Our fifth member, a restless and curious man named Ryan, often wandered off during hikes. We thought little of it, until that Saturday afternoon when he disappeared on a side trail. The forest seemed to swallow him whole. We waited, first with patience, then with mounting fear as daylight gave way to creeping shadows. Hours passed, the air growing heavier, a thick smell of wet earth and decaying leaves clinging to our nostrils. By nightfall, the panic set in. We shouted his name until our voices cracked, echoing off unseen ridges. The forest answered only with silence, and something in that silence made my stomach tighten. By morning, we split into pairs, scouring the trails, but Ryan was nowhere. Our imaginations ran wild with every snapping twig and rustling branch. We feared the worst, but clung to hope. On the fourth day, the park rangers found him, alive. At first, relief washed over us, but it was a relief tinged with unease. Ryan's clothes were almost immaculate, his boots untouched by mud, his skin unmarked after 4 days alone in the wilderness. There was something in his eyes, something blank, that made my skin crawl. He laughed at jokes that weren't funny, moved with a precision that felt inhuman. The campfire that night should have been a moment of celebration, but instead we watched him with growing dread. Then it happened. A scream that froze the air. Hannah, one of our friends, dragged across the campsite. Ryan had bitten her, his strength unnatural, almost impossible. The rescue team intervened, but when we turned, he was gone. To this day, the forest seems to whisper his name, and I cannot escape the feeling that he still walks those ridges, unseen and unknowable. The investigation that followed was as strange as the event itself. Rangers combed the woods for days, bringing dogs, infrared scanners, even helicopters, but Ryan was never found. Hannah survived, but she wouldn't speak about what happened, not to the rangers, not to us, not even to her own parents. She moved away within a month, and the last I heard, she'd changed her name and disappeared into another state entirely. I tried to make sense of it, to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe he had lost his mind out there. Maybe it was exhaustion, hunger, or dehydration that made him snap. But that didn't explain how clean his clothes were, or why he had no injuries after 4 nights in terrain that shreds boots and skin. That didn't explain the look in his eyes when he stared at the fire, unblinking, as if listening to something deep beneath the earth. Weeks later, I returned to the site alone, needing closure. The forest was quieter than I remembered, almost too quiet. Even the birds seemed to avoid that part of the trail. I found the spot where our campsite had been and noticed something strange, small. Precise piles of stones arranged in circles, perfectly symmetrical, too clean and deliberate to be natural. At the center of one circle was Ryan's bandana, the same one he had worn around his wrist the day he vanished. It was bone-dry, folded neatly, and placed on top of the stones as if waiting for someone to claim it. I didn't touch it. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it there. The wind picked up suddenly, carrying the smell of something metallic, like blood or rust, and I could swear I heard something moving in the tree line, slow and deliberate, keeping pace with my breathing. I left before the sun dipped too low, heart hammering so hard it drowned out every other sound. Driving away, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror that made me nearly swerve off the road. A man standing just beyond the tree line, completely still, wearing clothes that looked just like Ryan's the night he came back to camp. By the time I turned around, the figure was gone, swallowed by the forest like it had never been there. I never went back after that. Whatever happened to Ryan in those mountains, I don't think he was ever truly rescued. I think something found him first, something that wanted him, and on that fourth night, when we thought we'd gotten him back, we were wrong. Months passed, but the mountains never let me forget. The dream started not long after, always the same. I'm standing at the edge of the forest, the same trailhead where we last saw Ryan disappear. The trees are unnaturally still, not a leaf moving, and I can hear breathing that isn't mine coming from just inside the shadows. Then a voice, quiet but unmistakable, whispering my name. Every time I wake, my chest feels tight, like I've been holding my breath for hours. I told myself it was just guilt, just trauma, but part of me knew better. The rangers called me one evening with news that still chills me. Another hiker had gone missing in the same area. When they found him 3 days later, he was sitting cross-legged in the dirt, clothes clean, eyes wide, whispering over and over. It's listening. He couldn't explain what he meant, and eventually they had to sedate him. When I read about it online later, I found out others had reported strange encounters along that trail. Campers hearing footsteps around their tents at night. Hikers finding circles of stones with strange patterns carved into nearby tree bark. None of this ever made it into official reports, of course. The Park Service wanted to keep tourism alive, not scare people away. But those of us who had been there knew. One night, after too much whiskey and too little sleep, I packed a bag and drove back up to the Smokies, determined to face whatever this was. The air felt heavier than ever, wet and electric, like a storm about to break, but no storm came. Hours passed. Darkness settled in, and that was when I heard it. Footsteps behind me, deliberate, not animal, not random. I turned, flashlight cutting through the dark, and saw nothing. But I could feel it, watching me, close enough to raise goosebumps along my arms. Then I heard it, clear as day, a low, guttural laugh that sounded almost like Ryan's, but distorted, wrong, like someone imitating a human voice. My legs moved before I could think, carrying me back to my car in a blind sprint. Even after the engine roared to life, I could still hear that laugh, faint but following, until the road curved and the forest fell away behind me. That was the last time I ever set foot on that trail. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the laugh in my dreams. Closer each time. Story 2 begins deep in the heart of West Virginia, where the mountains are older, darker, and quieter, holding secrets that locals don't speak of to strangers. My name is Claire, and I grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone else. where the Appalachian hills surrounded us like a protective wall, or at least, that's what I used to believe. When I was 17, my best friend Maggie vanished. It was a cool October evening, the kind where the air smelled of burning leaves and wood smoke, and we were walking home from a church youth event. We always took the old service road, the one that cut through the backwoods and shaved 10 minutes off the trip. That night, Maggie seemed distracted, quiet. Halfway down the road, she stopped and said she thought she heard someone calling her name from the trees. I told her it was probably a fox, or maybe a drunk hunter yelling from his property. But she stepped closer to the tree line, tilting her head like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. "It's my mum," she whispered. "She's calling me." That didn't make sense. Maggie's mum was working a night shift at the diner, miles away. I grabbed her arm and told her we needed to keep walking, but she shook me off and stepped into the woods. I didn't want to go after her. Even then, I felt something was wrong, like the trees were waiting. I stood there, frozen, until I heard her scream. It was short, sharp, cut off like someone had put a hand over her mouth. I ran into the trees, heart hammering. But I didn't get far before I saw it. A pale figure standing between the trees, completely still. I couldn't make out a face, just the outline of a body, too tall and too thin to be Maggie. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. I stumbled backward and ran all the way home, sobbing and shaking. They never found Maggie. Search parties combed the woods for weeks, finding nothing, no shoe, no jacket, no sign of a struggle. The police asked me questions I couldn't answer. I never told them about the figure. Some nights, when the wind blew just right, I could still hear Maggie's voice calling faintly from those woods, almost begging me to follow. I never did. The years rolled on, but the memory of that night never left me. People in town stopped talking about Maggie after a while, like forgetting was the only way to survive. But I couldn't forget. I started reading everything I could about disappearances in the Appalachian region, and what I found terrified me. There were patterns. Other girls gone missing in nearby counties, always near the woods, always at dusk or just after dark. Locals spoke in hushed voices about something they called the calling, an old mountain legend about a spirit that lured people into the trees by mimicking the voice of someone they loved. Most folks dismissed it as folklore, but late at night, I couldn't stop hearing Maggie's last words in my head. "It's my mum. She's calling me." The more I thought about it, the more I wondered if I should have gone after her, if I could have dragged her back and saved her. That guilt ate at me until one night, 5 years later, I decided I had to face it. I went back to that road alone. It was early November this time, the leaves wet and slick underfoot, the air sharp with the smell of cold earth. I brought a flashlight and a kitchen knife, feeling foolish but desperate. As I neared the spot where Maggie had stepped off the road, the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No crickets, no owls, nothing but the sound of my own breathing. Then I heard it faint, almost too soft to catch, but unmistakable. Maggie's voice, calling my name from somewhere ahead. My throat closed up. It sounded exactly like her, the way she used to call me after school. My hands were shaking as I stepped off the road into the dark. The voice led me deeper, my flashlight beam cutting through the trees, until I saw something that stopped me cold. A small clearing, and in the center, Maggie's necklace hanging from a branch, swaying like it had just been placed there. Before I could move, I heard breathing behind me, slow, steady, not mine. I turned, and there it was, That same tall, pale figure, closer this time, its head tilted slightly like it was curious. My legs wouldn't move. It didn't step forward, didn't lunge, didn't speak. It just stood there until the flashlight flickered and went out. When it came back on, the clearing was empty, and the necklace was gone. I ran that night like something had set fire to my lungs, stumbling through the underbrush until I hit the road and didn't stop until I saw the headlights of my truck. I drove with white knuckles the whole way back to town, convinced that if I looked in the rearview mirror, I'd see that pale figure sitting in the bed of my truck, smiling at me. When I finally reached my driveway, I sat in the cab with the engine running, shaking so badly I could barely turn the key to shut it off. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat on the living room floor with every light on, knife still in hand, waiting for something to come through the door. Days passed, and nothing happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been followed home, that I had brought something back with me from those woods. A few weeks later, a hiker went missing just 2 miles from where Maggie had vanished. They never found him, just his pack, neatly placed on the trail, like he had set it down and walked away willingly. I stopped going near that stretch of road entirely. Even driving past it in the daylight made my chest tight. The worst part, sometimes, even now, I hear her voice again, soft, calling my name when I'm alone, usually just before it rains. Once, I swore I saw the necklace again, hanging from the branch of the oak tree in my backyard, glinting in the porch light. When I stepped outside, it was gone, but the grass underneath was wet like someone had been standing there. I've never told anyone about that night in the clearing, not even Maggie's parents. They deserve peace, even if I don't get any. And I don't think they'd believe me, not really. All I know is that the mountains remember. They keep things. And when they want something, they take it. If you're ever driving through those ridges at night and you hear someone you love calling from the woods, keep driving. Don't stop. Don't look back. Some things in the Appalachians are older than we are, and once they know your name, they don't forget it. Soft wind sound effect fades into low, tense background music as the story closes. Our next story takes us deeper into the mountains, where the road thins out and cell service vanishes. This one was told to me by a man named Curtis, a retired park ranger who swore he would never set foot near Raven's Hollow again. It was late October, he said, the season when the mountains turn copper and the nights start to feel mean. He'd been sent to check on a missing hunter, a man who hadn't returned after a weekend trip. The hunter's truck was still parked at the trailhead, frost on the windshield, but there were no footprints leading out, just tire tracks and silence. Curtis hiked the trail for miles, calling the man's name, his breath puffing white in the air, the sound swallowed by the trees. Around midday, he came across something strange, a half-burned campfire, still warm, with a deer carcass laid out beside it. But it wasn't gutted the way hunters usually do. It was whole, untouched, its eyes open and staring. Curtis said he'd been in the mountains his whole life and had never seen anything like it. He took a few pictures, then followed a faint path deeper into the hollow, hoping it would lead to the hunter. That's when he started hearing the singing, faint at first, almost like wind through the branches, but then clearer, rhythmic words he couldn't quite catch. It was coming from ahead, echoing off the hills. He crouched low, moving carefully until he saw them, 3 figures standing in a circle in a clearing, dressed in ragged clothes, their heads bowed, hands joined. Curtis froze, heart hammering. There were bones hanging from the trees all around them, strung up on twine, clacking softly like wind chimes. He stepped back, tried to stay quiet, but his boots snapped a twig and the singing stopped. All three heads turned toward him at once. Their faces were smeared with ash, their eyes pale and unblinking. Curtis said he'd never run so fast in his life. He didn't stop until he reached the truck, heart slamming against his ribs. When he looked back, just before driving away, he swore he saw one of them standing at the edge of the tree line, watching him go, their heads still tilted in that strange, silent way. Curtis told me that after that day, something about Raven's Hollow felt wrong, like the air itself was heavier. He filed his report, left out the part about the circle and the singing, just marked it as area clear, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the hunter's disappearance hadn't been an accident. 2 weeks later, another hiker vanished in almost the exact same spot. Search parties combed the woods. Dogs were brought in, helicopters flew low over the ridges, but nothing was ever found. Curtis went back once, against his better judgment, and found the fire pit again. This time, the deer carcass was gone, but in its place was a pile of stones stacked into a perfect spiral, with a single boot placed neatly at the center. He told me he picked it up, turned it over, and felt a chill run through him. There was no mud on the sole, no sign it had ever been worn. As he stood there, the singing started again, faint but unmistakable, threading through the trees like smoke. Curtis said he felt every instinct screaming at him to run, but something about the sound pulled at him, made him take one step forward, then another. His hand tightened on his flashlight until his knuckles turned white. The singing grew louder, until it felt like it was coming from all around him. From the trees, the ground, even inside his own head. He finally broke free and bolted, stumbling through the underbrush until his lungs burned. When he made it back to the trailhead, the truck's passenger door was open, even though he swore he'd locked it. There was a thin layer of ash on the driver's seat and a small, perfect spiral traced into the dust on the dashboard. Curtis said he put in for a transfer the next day and never went back. He told me this sitting on his porch, his hands trembling as he lit cigarette after cigarette, his eyes fixed on the dark tree line beyond his yard. "There's something out there," he said quietly, "and it doesn't want to be found, but it wants you to know it's there." Low, droning sound effect fades in, like distant chanting, before dropping into silence. Our third story comes from a woman named Laura who inherited an old family cabin deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. She'd grown up hearing her grandparents talk about it, a place where they spent summers fishing and berry picking when they were young, but no one had been up there in nearly 30 years. Laura decided to spend a weekend cleaning it out, thinking it might be a good place for retreats or to rent out as an Airbnb. The drive up was steep and winding, the kind where your ears pop and you lose radio signal halfway. She said the cabin looked almost frozen in time, dust on the windows, porch sagging, but otherwise just as her grandparents had described. Inside, it smelled like dry wood and something faintly metallic, like old nails or pennies. The first night was quiet, peaceful even. She unpacked, made herself tea, and sat on the porch watching the trees sway under a bright, full moon. It was the kind of silence that feels alive, where every creak and rustle carries weight. Sometime after midnight, Laura woke to a faint tapping sound, like something bumping against the side of the cabin. She lay there listening, heart pounding, until it stopped. The next morning, she found small, wet handprints on the porch railing, too small to be an adult's, spaced far apart as if whoever made them had been crawling. She took pictures, brushed them off, as maybe raccoon prints, and tried to focus on cleaning, but the thought kept gnawing at her. That night, the tapping came again, louder this time, and accompanied by what sounded like light footsteps circling the cabin. She sat up in bed, gripping the flashlight, her mouth dry. Just as she worked up the courage to look out the window, she heard it, a child's laughter, high and thin, coming from just beyond the porch. Laura said her blood ran cold. She didn't move until sunrise. When she finally stepped outside, there were no footprints in the dirt, no sign anyone had been there, just her own tracks from the day before. She told herself she was imagining things, that the mountain air was playing tricks on her. But that evening, when the sun dipped low and the forest turned shadowy and gold, she found something waiting for her on the porch, a small, carved wooden doll, soaked through as if it had been pulled from the bottom of the lake. Laura didn't remember ever seeing the doll before, and it looked old, its painted face worn smooth, one of its little arms cracked nearly in half. She left it on the porch and went back inside, trying to convince herself it was just some old toy left behind by her family decades ago. But as night fell, that sense of dread came back stronger, crawling up her spine. Around midnight, she woke to the sound of the front door creaking open. Her stomach dropped. She'd locked it, she was sure she had. She grabbed the flashlight and crept into the front room, every step making the floorboards moan under her weight. The door was standing wide open, moonlight spilling across the floor. The doll was gone. She slammed the door shut, locked it again, and pushed a chair under the knob. Sleep was impossible after that, so she sat in the corner of the room, knees pulled up, waiting for dawn. At some point in the early hours, she must have dozed off because she woke to find the doll back on the porch, right where it had been before. Only this time, its head was turned toward the door, as if it had been watching her all night. Laura said that was the moment she decided she wasn't staying another night. She stuffed what little she had unpacked back into her bag, loaded the car, and tried not to look at the porch as she left. But when she backed down the drive, her headlights caught something in the tree line, a figure, small and thin, standing just beyond the first row of pines. It wasn't moving, just watching, its head tilted slightly, arms hanging at its sides. Laura said she couldn't tell if it was a child or something pretending to be one, but the feeling in her chest told her to keep driving. When she reached the bottom of the mountain, she pulled over, shaking so hard she could barely turn the key to shut the engine off. She left the cabin keys in the glove box and never went back. To this day, when she talks about that weekend, she swears she still dreams about the doll sometimes, always wet, always staring at her from the foot of her bed, waiting for her to move. Soft creaking wood sound fades under narration. Distant child's laugh echoes briefly, then cuts. Our fourth story comes from a truck driver named Elias, who ran freight through the Appalachian backroads for nearly 20 years before quitting. After one night that he refuses to call anything but the hollow incident, he told me it was a foggy night in late September, the kind where the world feels like it's been wrapped in wet wool. The road he was on was barely wide enough for his rig, twisting through a narrow pass, his headlights slicing through the mist. Around 2 a.m., he saw something up ahead, a figure standing dead center in the road. At first he thought it was a deer, then maybe a hiker, but as he slowed, he realized it was a man, tall, wearing a long coat, his head slightly bowed. Elias laid on the horn, but the figure didn't move. He swerved to the shoulder, barely missing him, and when he looked in the mirror, the road was empty. Shaken, he kept driving, telling himself it was a trick of the fog, maybe a branch or shadow he mistook for a man. But 20 minutes later, he saw him again, this time standing just beyond the guardrail, facing the truck as it passed. Elias gripped the wheel tighter and didn't look back. The third time, he almost ran off the road. The figure was crouched in the middle of the lane, hands on the asphalt, head turned toward him as he approached. Elias said every hair on his body stood up. He slammed the brakes, skidding to a stop just feet away. But when he jumped out of the cab with a flashlight, nothing. The road was slick and empty, the fog curling low around his boots. Then he heard it, 3 slow knocks on the side of his trailer. He spun around, light darting across the metal, but no one was there. The knocking came again, this time from the cab. Elias scrambled back inside, locked the doors, and floored it, not stopping until he hit the next town. When he finally got out to inspect the rig, there were 3 perfect handprints smeared into the grime on the side of the trailer. Each one was elongated, too long to be human, with deep scratches dragging down from the fingertips like claws. Low, metallic knocking sound effect fades in, steady and rhythmic, as if coming from inside the listener's room. Elias said that after that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him. Even weeks later, running routes in broad daylight, he'd catch glimpses of a shape in his side, mirrors, a figure just standing by the road, always too far away to see clearly, but always facing him. He stopped taking night hauls altogether, but it didn't seem to matter. One afternoon, he pulled into a rest stop for coffee and came back to find 3 fresh handprints on the side of his cab, wet and smeared like someone had just pressed against the metal with dirty palms. The manager swore no one had gone near his truck, but Elias didn't argue. He drove straight home, parked the rig, and left it running while he walked a slow circle around it, flashlight in hand even though it was broad daylight. He said the air felt wrong, heavy, like a thunderstorm about to break. That night, he slept in a motel instead of going home. Around 3 a.m., something woke him, 3 knocks, slow and deliberate, coming from the door of his room. He froze in bed, staring at the knob. The knocks came again, and this time he swore he saw the shadow of feet under the door. Elias didn't move until dawn. When he finally opened the door, the hallway was empty. But there were 3 long scratches running down the wood, deep enough to catch his fingertip. He checked out that morning, quit his job the same week, and sold the rig to another driver. Some things, he told me, his voice low, aren't meant to be outrun. But you can choose to stop inviting them back. To this day, Elias won't drive through that stretch of road, won't even talk about which route it was. He keeps his curtains shut tight at night and never answers the door after dark. Sometimes, when he tells this story, he says he still hears those knocks. Not on motel doors anymore, but on the walls of his house, just after midnight. Always 3, always slow, and every time he sits there in the dark, holding his breath, waiting for whoever or whatever is outside to stop. Faint knocking sound fades in under narration, then stops abruptly, leaving a long, tense silence. Our 5th story comes from a college student named Hannah, who took a summer job working maintenance at a small mountain resort tucked miles off the main road. She said the place was gorgeous during the day. Postcard-perfect cabins, a glassy lake, endless hiking trails, but the nights felt wrong, like the woods were pressing in closer than they should. One evening, near the end of July, she was sent to check on one of the older cabins after a guest reported a strange smell coming from the crawl space. Hannah grabbed a flashlight and went alone, figuring it was a dead raccoon or maybe a busted pipe. The sun was just starting to set when she got there, bathing the cabin in red light that made everything look sharper, almost hostile. She crouched near the porch, lifted the hatch, and immediately gagged. The smell was thick and sour, like wet copper and rotting leaves. Holding her breath, she shined the light inside and froze. There were dozens of animal bones scattered in the dirt under the cabin, arranged in small circles and spirals, some still slick with fresh tissue. She scrambled back, heart pounding, and ran to get her supervisor. When they returned less than 15 minutes later, the smell was gone. The hatch stood open, but the crawl space was empty, not a single bone in sight, the dirt smooth as if it had just been raked. Her supervisor gave her a look like she was crazy and told her to close it up and head back. That night, Hannah barely slept. Around 2 a.m., she woke to a scraping sound outside her window, like something being dragged across the porch. She sat up, every muscle tense, as the sound circled the cabin once, then stopped. She waited in the silence until her alarm went off at dawn. When she stepped outside, her stomach dropped. Small bones had been placed on the porch steps during the night, forming an arrow pointing toward the woods. Hannah didn't say a word to anyone. She packed her bag, got in her car, and drove until she saw the first highway sign. When she called the resort later to quit, no one answered. Weeks later, she got a final paycheck in the mail with no note, just a tiny bone tucked inside the envelope. Low, clicking bone sound effect fades in, echoing unnaturally before being swallowed by silence. Hannah said she kept that bone in a drawer for weeks, too scared to throw it away but too afraid to keep looking at it. Eventually, she drove out to the river and tossed it in, watching until the current carried it out of sight. She thought that would be the end of it, but a few nights later, she woke to the sound of something tapping against her bedroom window. At first, she thought it was a branch, but the rhythm was too steady. 3 sharp taps, a pause, then 3 more. Heart hammering, she pulled back the curtain and saw nothing but her own reflection. The next morning, when she stepped outside, there was a fresh pile of small bones stacked neatly on the welcome mat. She left them there, locked her door, and spent the day at a friend's house. When she returned that night, the bones were gone, but the front door was standing wide open, even though she had locked it that morning. Hannah called the police, but nothing was stolen, nothing was disturbed. The officer on duty told her it was probably kids playing a prank. She didn't argue, but she couldn't stop noticing the dirt on her living room floor, like someone had walked barefoot across it. For weeks after, Hannah barely slept, jumping at every creak of the house. Then, one night, she woke to find something at the foot of her bed. Not someone, something. In the dim light from the street lamp outside, she could just make out its shape. Small and thin, hunched low like it was crouching. Its head tilted toward her, slow and deliberate, before it slipped backward into the shadows and disappeared. Hannah said she left town the next morning, breaking her lease and driving across 3 states to stay with her sister. Even now, years later, she refuses to live anywhere near the mountains. It doesn't matter how pretty they are, she told me. The woods aren't empty. You just can't always see what's in them. But they can see you. Background, sound, faint dragging noise under narration. Distant tapping fades in and then cuts sharply, leaving an uneasy silence for several seconds. Our 6th story comes from a man named Jace, who worked as a surveyor for a logging company deep in the Allegheny Range. He spent weeks at a time in the backcountry marking tree lines and flagging plots, often camping alone for days. He said he was used to the silence, the long nights, even the coyotes calling in the distance. But there was one section of forest that made him uneasy every time he passed through. The trees grew unnaturally close together there, their trunks pale and thin, their branches twisted like knuckles. No birds ever sang in that stretch, no insects hummed, just a dead, muffled stillness that set his teeth on edge. One evening, near the end of a long day, he realized he'd stayed out too late and was still deep in that silent patch. He set up camp quickly, lit a fire, and tried to shake the feeling that something was watching him from the dark. Around midnight, he woke to the sound of crunching leaves just outside the tent, slow, deliberate, like footsteps circling. Jace said he held his breath, listening as the steps moved closer, then stopped completely. He waited, knife in hand, until the fire burned low, but nothing happened. When dawn broke, he stepped outside to find a perfect ring of stones surrounding his tent that hadn't been there the night before. Each stone was flat and smooth, placed with care. Jace dismantled the circle, scattered the stones, and broke camp. But as he hiked out, he kept finding more little stacks of stones at the base of trees, balanced on stumps. Even one sitting right in the middle of the trail, like a warning. That night, he made camp miles away, thinking he'd left whatever it was behind. But just before dawn, he woke to find the stones back, this time stacked around his fire pit in a spiral. He didn't bother eating breakfast. He packed his gear and left, moving as fast as he could until he hit the service road. When he came back a month later with the crew, that entire section of forest had been flagged for harvest. But every survey marker they placed was gone by morning, replaced by more stones, this time forming a line across the road, blocking the trucks. The crew called it bad luck and moved the line. But Jace put in his notice that same day. Jace said leaving that job was the best decision he ever made. But he still dreams about that forest, and in the dreams, the stones aren't just stacked, they're carved. Faces hollow-eyed and long, mouths open in silent screams. He wakes up drenched in sweat, sometimes with the taste of dirt in his mouth, as if he'd been chewing soil in his sleep. He told me once that he doesn't believe in ghosts, but he's sure there was something out there that didn't want him, or anyone, cutting those trees. He said he's heard rumors since, from other surveyors, that whole sections of flagged forest go mysteriously unharvestable because equipment fails, GPS stops working, or workers refuse to go back in after seeing figures standing in the trees at night. One guy claimed he saw a pale woman walking just beyond the tree line, always facing away from him, never turning her head. Jace doesn't know if that's true, but he said it doesn't matter. Whatever lives in those mountains is older than the roads, older than the towns, maybe older than the people who first walked there. He said when you spend enough time in the backcountry, you start to feel it, the sense that you're trespassing, that the ground you're standing on doesn't belong to you. Jace doesn't hike anymore, not even on marked trails. I used to love the woods, he told me, but after that, it's like the forest started looking back at me. And once you feel that, you can't unfeel it. His words stuck with me, because I've heard that same sentiment from so many people who've spent real time in the Appalachians. The mountains don't just keep secrets, they decide who gets to leave. Background sound, slow rising hum, faint wind through trees. Then a sharp crack of a branch breaking, letting silence linger. That was story 6, and if you've been watching this far, you know the rule by now. Check your locks, dim the lights, and get comfortable, because these last 2 stories are the ones that still keep me awake. Our seventh story begins with a group of friends on a road trip who decided to take a detour through a forgotten mining town. It was supposed to be a quick stop, just long enough to snap some photos of the crumbling buildings. But what they found there was far worse than empty houses and rusted equipment. The town didn't even have a name on the map anymore, just a faded dot off a narrow gravel road. The four of them, Alex, Mariah, Luke, and Donnie, parked near what had once been the general store. Its roof caved in and windows boarded over. The air smelled like wet stone and rust, heavy and metallic, like blood after a nosebleed. They wandered through the ruins, laughing at first, daring each other to peek inside the leaning shacks and collapsed mine entrances. But as the sun dipped lower, the laughter died. There were no animal tracks anywhere, no birds in the trees, no sound except their own footsteps crunching on gravel. Donnie said it felt like they'd stumbled into a place the world had forgotten, or a place it had meant to forget. They decided to leave before dark, but when they got back to the car, all four tires were slashed. At first, they thought it was a prank. Maybe some local who didn't want strangers snooping around, but there were no fresh footprints in the dirt. They argued about what to do, finally deciding to walk to the highway. Half a mile down the road, they saw a figure standing in the middle of it, tall, thin, dressed in old mining overalls. Luke called out, thinking maybe this was someone who could help, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, head tilted slightly to one side. The group backed up slowly, deciding to cut through the woods to get around it, but every time they reached the road again, the figure was there, closer each time, still standing, still silent. The sky was almost black now, the woods filling with shadows, and Mariah swore she heard footsteps behind them, perfectly matching their own. When they finally reached the highway hours later, exhausted and shaking, a trucker stopped and gave them a ride to the nearest town. The next day, they went back for the car with a tow truck. It was gone. No skid marks, no broken glass, no sign it had ever been there, just for perfect circles of gravel where the tires had sat, and a single rusty pickaxe stuck in the ground where the hood should have been. The tow driver wouldn't even get out of his truck. He told them some places are better left to rot, and if they were smart, they'd never come back. They didn't come back, but Alex couldn't stop thinking about it. Weeks passed, then months, yet the memory clung to him like smoke in his lungs. At night he'd wake drenched in sweat, hearing phantom footsteps outside his apartment door, that same steady rhythm from the forgotten mining road. He stopped talking about it with the others, though he could see the same exhaustion in their eyes whenever they met. One night, unable to sleep, he opened his laptop and dug through old records. The town had been called Hallowick, a mining settlement that boomed briefly in the late 1800s before collapsing into ruin. According to the few fragments of history he could find, the mine had shut down after a cave-in trapped more than 30 men underground. Their bodies were never recovered. The company had abandoned the site, leaving families stranded, their homes collapsing, their lives swallowed by the earth. A newspaper clipping he found used a chilling phrase, "the town of the waiting dead." It suggested the miners' relatives refused to leave, believing the men would claw their way back to the surface. Alex scrolled through photos, gaunt women in tattered dresses standing in front of shacks, children barefoot in mud, their eyes hollow. In one blurred photo, a tall man stood behind them, his head tilted slightly to one side. Alex froze, bile rising in his throat. He zoomed in as far as the grainy image would allow. The posture was identical to the figure they'd seen on the road. He slammed the laptop shut and tried to convince himself it was coincidence, an old photograph playing tricks on his memory. But the dread wouldn't leave. The next morning, Donnie texted him out of the blue, "Did you hear footsteps last night?" Alex's heart stuttered. He hadn't told anyone about the sounds in his hallway. He typed back, "Yes." She didn't respond. When he called her, the line went straight to voicemail. The following week, Mariah disappeared too. Her roommate said she'd gone for a late-night walk and never came back. Luke moved out of state, but Alex knew it wouldn't matter. He lay awake at night, staring at the door, waiting for the scrape of boots on the floor outside. The figure hadn't just stayed in Halloween. It was following them, dragging them back one by one, as if the earth itself had sent something to collect its debt. By winter, Alex had stopped sleeping altogether. The footsteps no longer stayed in the hallway. They moved closer inside the apartment, now pacing from room to room at night. He'd lie there, sheets clutched in his fists, counting each slow, deliberate step until dawn bled through the blinds. He tried moving once, packed everything into a rented van and drove 3 states over. But the first night in his new place, he woke to find a trail of wet boot prints leading from the front door to his bed. He didn't bother unpacking after that. He started leaving offerings by the door, scraps of food, bottles of water, even coins, anything to make it stop. Nothing worked. Donnie's body was found in spring, deep in the woods, miles from her house. The police said she must have gotten lost, but Alex knew better. She'd been buried upright, as if someone had planted her there, her head tilted at the same impossible angle. After that, Alex stopped leaving his apartment. He nailed the windows shut, taped the light switches so they stayed on. Nights became a blur of silence, so thick it hurt his ears, followed by the sound of something dragging across the floor, closer each time. One night, he woke to find the pickaxe from Halloween standing upright at the foot of his bed. The metal head was damp, leaving a dark stain on the carpet. Alex screamed until his throat bled, but no one came. By morning, the pickaxe was gone, but the stain remained. He called Luke, begging him to talk, to tell him if anything strange had happened, but Luke's phone had been disconnected. Desperate, Alex drove back to Halloween. The road was overgrown now, weeds pushing through the gravel, but the empty space where their car had once been sat untouched. The pickaxe was back, embedded in the ground, this time with fresh dirt caked to its edge. He knelt there until sunset, shaking, whispering apologies to the earth, to the men buried below. When he finally stood, the figure was there again, just beyond the tree line, closer than it had ever been. Alex didn't run this time. He stepped toward it, the air cold and still as a grave. When he was found months later, his apartment was empty except for a single pair of muddy boot prints leading from the door to the bed, and the faint sound of footsteps that neighbors swore they still hear at night, pacing. The next story comes from a park ranger who worked deep in the Appalachian backcountry, miles from the nearest town. He'd been on the job for nearly a decade and thought he'd seen it all. Missing hikers, bear encounters, even an illegal grow operation hidden in a gorge, but nothing prepared him for what he found that summer. He was patrolling a remote fire road when he spotted something pale on the ground ahead, a faint shimmer in the early morning mist. At first he thought it was trash, maybe a sheet of plastic left behind by campers, but as he got closer, he realized it was a shirt, perfectly laid out in the middle of the road, arms folded neatly across the chest as if someone had pressed it there with care. It was damp, the fabric cold to the touch, though it hadn't rained in days. A few feet away, he found a boot, upright and facing toward the woods, like someone had stepped out of it mid-stride. There were no tracks, no scuff marks, no drag patterns, just the single boot and the shirt. The ranger radioed it in, but before anyone could arrive, he decided to follow what looked like a faint trail leading into the trees. The deeper he went, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no insects, just the sound of his own breathing and the crunch of leaves under his boots. The trail twisted sharply around a boulder, and that's when he saw it, an entire clearing lined with clothing. Shirts, jeans, jackets, even hats, all laid out in strange, deliberate patterns on the ground. Some were stacked, others were arranged in a circle, sleeves touching like spokes on a wheel. The ranger's throat went dry. There was no sign of backpacks, no personal items, no bones or blood, just the clothes, damp and heavy with dew, but arranged with a precision that felt wrong, almost reverent. He backed away slowly, radio still in his hand, but the signal had cut out. By the time he made it back to the road, the shirt and the boot were gone, vanished as though they'd never been there. When he returned later with backup, the clearing was empty too, nothing but bare dirt and dead leaves, disturbed just enough to show that something had been moved. That night, sitting in his cabin, he swore he heard something outside, soft, dragging sounds, like wet fabric being pulled across the porch. The ranger barely slept that night, every creak of the cabin making his pulse spike. At some point, exhaustion won and he drifted off, but when he woke just before dawn, he saw something that made his blood run cold. His own uniform shirt was gone from the chair where he'd left it. The window was cracked open, though he was sure he'd locked it before bed. Outside, the ground was damp as if it had rained, but the forecast had been clear. He followed the wet trail around the cabin and found his shirt hanging neatly from a low branch at the edge of the woods. Sleeves crossed exactly like the one he'd found on the road. It was soaking wet. That was the moment he called it in for real, telling his supervisor he needed backup immediately. They sent 2 other rangers, but by the time they arrived, the shirt was gone again, and so was the wet trail. They searched the area all morning, even brought in a tracking dog, but the animal refused to go near the tree line, whining and pulling on its lead until they turned back. The ranger decided to take a few days off and drove into town, staying in a cheap motel just to get some sleep. The first night passed without incident, but on the second night, he woke to the sound of dripping water. When he turned on the light, there were wet footprints leading from the door to the bed. Not boot prints, bare feet, narrow and long, like they belonged to someone who had been walking through mud. They stopped right at the edge of the mattress, toes pointing toward him. The ranger grabbed his gun and checked every inch of the room, but the door was still locked from the inside, the windows latched. There was no one there. He didn't sleep again, just sat in the chair until sunrise with the gun across his lap. He turned in his resignation the next day, left the park entirely, and moved 3 states away. But even years later, he says he still wakes sometimes in the dead of night to that sound of slow dripping water, and once, just once, he swears he saw a pair of damp jeans folded carefully on his front porch, waiting. The final story comes from a hiker named Claire who had been section hiking the Appalachian Trail for years without incident. She was experienced, confident, and meticulous about safety. She left detailed itineraries, checked in daily when she had service, and never hiked after dark. One autumn afternoon, she reached a shelter deep in the woods just before sunset. It was empty, which was unusual for that time of year, but she was glad to have it to herself. She built a small fire, cooked dinner, and watched the light fade through the trees. The forest was silent, unusually so, like the whole world was holding its breath. When the last of the fire died down, she heard something behind the shelter, not footsteps exactly, more like the sound of fabric brushing against bark. She called out, thinking maybe another hiker had arrived late, but no one answered. Claire shined her headlamp into the trees and saw nothing. The sound stopped. Uneasy, she zipped herself into her sleeping bag, knife within reach. Sometime after midnight, she woke to a faint rustling near the shelter entrance. She held her breath, listening. The noise came again, closer this time, and then she saw it, a jacket, her own jacket, being dragged slowly across the dirt toward the tree line by something she couldn't see. She bolted upright, shouted, and the jacket dropped, motionless. Claire didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, she packed as fast as she could and started down the trail. After a mile, she glanced back and nearly fell. Her jacket was folded neatly in the middle of the trail behind her, arms crossed, perfectly placed. She left it, heart hammering, and pushed on. At the next trail junction, she met 2 other hikers and told them what had happened. They offered to walk with her to the next shelter. That night, all 3 of them stayed awake by the fire, talking quietly, trying to laugh it off. Around 3 a.m., one of the hikers went quiet, staring into the dark. Claire followed his gaze. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the firelight, was a pile of clothes, shirts, jackets, socks, all damp, stacked carefully into a human shape, lying flat on the ground. None of them moved until sunrise. By then, the clothes were gone. Claire quit hiking after that trip, and to this day she refuses to sleep anywhere she can't lock the door. Claire's story might have ended there, but months later she received a small, unmarked package in the mail. Inside was a single folded sock, not hers, but one of the same brand and color she had been wearing on the trail that night. There was no note, no return address, just the sock, still faintly damp as if it had been left out in the dew. Claire threw it away, but the next morning it was back on her porch, folded the exact same way. That was when she moved. She sold her house, changed her number, and left no forwarding address. When I spoke to her, years later, her voice was calm but flat, like someone who had learned to live with an unsolvable problem. She told me she still finds items of clothing in places they shouldn't be in her locked car. In her kitchen sink, once even laid carefully across her pillow when she came home from work. They're never hers, never familiar, but always damp, always carefully arranged. She keeps them now, stacking them in a box in the garage, afraid to throw them away again. She says it feels like a warning, though she doesn't know for what. It's not violent, she told me quietly, but it's patient. Whatever it is, it's not in a hurry. It's just reminding me it's still out there, that it knows where I am, and that's the thread that runs through all of these stories, isn't it? The Appalachian Mountains are vast and old, older than memory, older than history. People disappear out there more often than we like to admit. Sometimes there are explanations, falls, predators, exposure, but sometimes there aren't. Sometimes all that's left behind is a shoe in the middle of the trail, a shirt folded carefully on a rock, a sound in the woods that follows you long after you've left. So if you ever find yourself deep in those mountains and the forest goes quiet, and you see something on the ground that looks too carefully placed to be an accident, My advice is simple. Don't touch it. Don't take it. And whatever you do, don't look back when you leave. Because some things out there aren't lost. They're waiting. And once they've chosen you, they might never stop reminding you that they know exactly where you sleep. And maybe that's the part that unsettles me most. The idea that some places aren't just haunted, they're watching. I've spoken with locals who've lived their entire lives along the Appalachian ridges. People whose grandparents and great-grandparents told them not to go into certain hollows after dark, not to follow strange lights in the trees, not to answer when someone calls your name from the woods at night. They talk about it like it's weather, just another fact of life up there. One old man told me a story about a search party that went out for a missing hunter back in the 1960s. They found his rifle leaning against a tree, fully loaded, but no sign of him. 3 days later, they found his boots sitting side by side on a boulder near a creek. His clothes turned up next, folded and stacked on the front steps of his own cabin 10 miles away. The man himself was never seen again. The sheriff at the time wrote it off as hypothermia-induced delirium, but everyone in town knew better. The mountain takes what it wants, the old man told me, staring past me like he could still see that creek in his mind. He said his father had been part of that search party and never went back into the woods again after that day. There's a pattern to these stories if you pay attention. The neatness, the care, the deliberate way things are left behind. It feels less like chaos and more like a ritual, like something is marking a line between what belongs to it and what doesn't. And when I think about Alex, Donnie, Mariah, and Luke, or the ranger, or Claire, when I think about how their stories don't really end, just trail off like an unfinished path, I wonder if that's the point. Maybe the mountain isn't interested in killing you outright. Maybe it wants you to know you're being chosen, piece by piece, until there's nothing left to take but you. So if you're listening to this right now, wherever you are, take a second and really listen. Is it quiet? Too quiet? Do you hear something brushing against the outside of your house, or a faint wet sound near your door? Because sometimes these stories don't stay on the mountain. Sometimes they follow you home, and that's why I always tell people, don't take these stories lightly. They aren't just campfire tales meant to spook you. They're warnings passed down because someone, somewhere, saw something they couldn't explain and didn't want you to make the same mistake. The Appalachian Range is ancient, older than bones, and it remembers everything that happens within it. When you stand on one of those ridges at night, under a moon that barely cuts through the mist, you feel that memory pressing in on you, a weight in the air, a pressure on your chest. It's not just the wilderness making you feel small. It's the sense that you're being measured, that something out there is deciding whether you get to leave. And maybe that's why the stories so often end with people disappearing, or finding their belongings rearranged, or hearing those deliberate footsteps just out of sight. It's not random. It's an invitation. Or maybe it's a countdown. I've been out there myself, on trails where the fog rolls in so thick you can't see 5 feet ahead, and I swear you can hear things moving just beyond the veil. Not deer, not coyotes, something heavier, slower, patient. The kind of sound that makes you freeze because every part of you is screaming not to make a noise. And when you finally step back onto the road or into the clearing and you realize the sound has stopped, it's almost worse, because now you know it heard you too. That's the thing that lingers for everyone who's lived through one of these encounters, the sense that it's not over. Claire's box of damp clothes, the ranger's shirt on the tree branch, Alex's pickaxe at the foot of the bed. These are reminders, tokens, maybe even warnings, left with the kind of precision that tells you it wasn't random chance. It was meant for you. And so, when I end this episode tonight, I want you to do something for me. Lock your doors, turn off the lights, sit in the dark for a few minutes, and just listen. If it stays quiet, good. But if you hear something soft, slow, dragging across the floor, don't look. Don't open the door. Because once you see what's waiting, there's no guarantee you'll ever be able to leave it behind. And that brings us to the close of tonight's stories, but not to the end of the fear. Because if there's one thing I've learned after hearing these accounts over and over again, it's that the terror doesn't stop when you leave the mountains. It just goes quiet, waiting for the right moment to remind you. That's why the people who've survived these encounters always seem different afterward. They speak slower, they glance over their shoulders more, they stop going outside after dark. It's like a part of them never came back from those woods, like something is still out there holding it hostage. And that's what makes these stories so uniquely disturbing. There's no clean ending, no final confrontation where the monster is slain or the ghost is banished. It just lingers, hovering in the corners of memory, daring you to forget so it can come back stronger. Maybe that's why the Appalachians have such a reputation. There are other mountains in the world, but few that seem to breathe the way these do. Few that feel so alive and so willing to take. When you drive those winding roads late at night, with the mist hugging the pavement and the trees forming a tunnel overhead, it's hard not to imagine eyes watching from the tree line, following your headlights as you pass. And maybe you should imagine it. Maybe you should respect it. Because if you go up there thinking it's just another hiking trip, just another weekend getaway, you might come back with more than you bargained for, or not come back at all. So I'll leave you with this. If you ever find yourself deep in the Appalachian backcountry, and you hear that strange silence, the one that seems to pull all the sound out of the air, pay attention. If you see something that doesn't look right, a shirt too neatly folded, a boot standing upright when no one should be, walk away. Don't try to be curious. Don't try to be brave. Curiosity is how people vanish out there. And when you get home, when you lock your door and turn out the lights, and you hear that faint drip of water or those footsteps just outside your window, remember this episode. Because maybe it's just your mind playing tricks on you, or maybe something from the mountains followed you home. And if it did follow you home, there's a good chance you'll know soon enough. Survivors often talk about the first sign being small, almost easy to dismiss, a single wet footprint on a tile floor, a piece of clothing missing and then showing up somewhere it shouldn't be, a faint knocking that doesn't seem to come from the door or the walls, but from somewhere deeper, like inside the house itself. It starts subtle, almost polite, but it escalates. It always escalates. That's when you find yourself double-checking locks, sleeping with the lights on, leaving the TV running just to drown out the silence. And maybe that's the real horror of these stories. They turn your own home into a trap, a place where you're no longer safe. One man I spoke with swore he could hear breathing in his hallway every night at exactly 3:12 a.m. Soft, steady, patient. He eventually set up a camera, determined to catch whatever it was. But when he played back the footage, the screen just went black for 2 minutes and 34 seconds, then came back on to show his front door standing wide open. He moved out a week later. Even now, years later, he says he still wakes up at 3:12. No matter where he lives, no matter how far he's gone from those mountains. That's the thing, distance doesn't seem to matter. These stories have a way of sticking to people, almost like the mountains tag you, mark you, and keep track of you no matter where you go. Which is why I always end these episodes with the same warning. Respect the silence. If you're out there in the Appalachians and the woods go quiet, don't ignore it. Leave something behind if you have to. Food, a piece of clothing, even a coin. It might not do anything, but it might. And when you get back to civilization, pay attention to the little things. Notice if something feels out of place, if something seems to be waiting for you. Because maybe it is. And if you ever find a piece of clothing neatly folded on your porch, or your hallway is suddenly too quiet, do yourself a favor, don't touch it, don't move it, and don't stay there another night. Some debts can't be paid, but they can be avoided if you leave fast enough. And maybe that's why these stories keep getting told generation after generation, not just as entertainment, but as warnings. Old mountain families used to say the forest has a memory, that it doesn't forget those who disturb it. When you hear a branch snap where no one should be, when you smell wood smoke but see no fire, when you catch a glimpse of a figure too far away to be real, yet too close to ignore, that's the mountain remembering you. I've come to believe these aren't just ghost stories or old wives' tales. They're survival guides passed down through time, encoded in fear. The silence isn't just eerie, it's a message. The missing hikers, the strange lights, the sudden chills, all warnings to leave. But we've become arrogant. We build trails, campsites, scenic overlooks, and we think we've tamed it. We think we own it. And then, every year, the headlines remind us that we don't. Another disappearance. Another unsolved case. Another family who went up the mountain and didn't come back. It happens so often it barely makes the news now, and that's what terrifies me most. We've normalized it. We've accepted that there are places where people just vanish and we shrug it off as bad luck or getting lost. But if you've heard the stories, if you've been out there in that choking quiet, you know it's more than that. The forest isn't just a backdrop, it's an active participant. It decides who stays, who goes, and who comes back broken. And maybe that's the real horror, not some creature lurking in the dark, but the idea that nature itself can turn on you, that the ground under your feet can choose to swallow you. So as we wrap up tonight's episode, do me one last favor. Turn down the lights just for a moment and sit with the sound of your own house around you. Listen to the creaks, the hums, the faint shifting in the walls. Ask yourself if you're truly alone right now. And if you aren't, if some part of you feels like there's something just beyond the edge of the dark. Watching, waiting, don't ignore it. Fear is there to keep you alive. Trust it. Because next time you find yourself out there on a lonely trail, with the mist crawling in and the silence pressing against your ears, that fear might be the only thing that gets you back down the mountain, and that, more than anything, is why I keep sharing these stories. Because fear, real fear, isn't just a thrill, it's a compass. It tells you when you've gone too far, when you need to turn back, when something beyond your understanding is taking notice of you. The people who ignore it, who laugh at it, who tell themselves there's nothing out there, they're the ones who end up as headlines, names carved into wooden crosses at the edge of forgotten trails. And maybe that's why the old-timers used to tell their kids never to whistle in the woods, never to call out a name after dark, never to follow the sound of crying. They didn't say why, but they didn't need to. The fear was enough. I think about that a lot, about how fear used to be respected. Today we treat it like a weakness, something to be conquered, but maybe we were never supposed to conquer it. maybe we were supposed to listen. Because these mountains, these endless forests, they aren't empty, they're full. Full of memory, full of shadow, full of something that doesn't need to explain itself to us. And when you stand out there in the dead quiet, the kind where you can hear your own heartbeat in your ears, you start to realize you aren't just a visitor, you're an intruder. And the mountain decides what to do with intruders. So as you turn this video off and go about your night, keep that thought in the back of your mind. Maybe you'll never set foot in the Appalachians. Maybe you live hundreds of miles from the nearest ridge. But the dark isn't limited by geography. It's everywhere, waiting in the spaces where the light doesn't reach. If you feel the temperature drop for no reason, if the air suddenly gets too still, if you wake up in the middle of the night with the sense that something is standing just outside your bedroom door, remember these stories. Remember the mountains. And remember that sometimes the smartest thing you can do is nothing at all. Don't look, don't call out, don't move, wait, listen. And if you're lucky, whatever it is will decide to leave you be. And if it doesn't, well, then you'll understand why some people never come back from the mountains, even when they make it home. Because coming home doesn't always mean you've escaped. Sometimes it just means you've brought something back with you. Survivors talk about how it changes them, how the fear never fully lets go. They'll be washing dishes one night and hear the faint crunch of leaves outside their window. Or they'll see a shadow move against the tree line when there's no wind. One woman I interviewed swore she could smell pine needles in her living room every night around midnight, even though she lived in the middle of a city with no forest for miles. She said she would wake up to find mud tracked across her kitchen floor in the shape of bare feet. But her doors were locked, her windows shut. She called the police once, but by the time they arrived, the footprints had dried and crumbled into dust, like they had been there for years. That's the kind of thing these stories leave you with. A constant reminder that the experience didn't end where you think it did. And it's why I tell people to think twice before seeking these places out. You might get your thrill, your eerie photo, your adrenaline rush, but you might also leave a part of yourself behind, a part the mountain refuses to give back. And the worst part, no one will believe you when you try to explain it. They'll say it was just the wind, just a dream, just stress playing tricks on your mind. But you'll know. You'll know because the silence will follow you, stretching behind every conversation, hanging in every room like smoke. It becomes a weight you carry, and sometimes it gets heavier with time. That's why I always warn my listeners, be careful what you go looking for. The mountains don't care about your curiosity, and they don't owe you answers. They take what they want, and sometimes what they want is you. So, if you ever find yourself on one of those back roads late at night, headlights cutting through the mist, and you see someone standing perfectly still at the edge of the tree line, don't stop. Don't slow down. Keep driving, no matter what you think you saw. Curiosity might lead to answers, but out there, it's just as likely to lead to an ending. The final story tonight isn't the loudest, but maybe it's the one that stuck with me the most because of how quiet it was. A man named Eric sent me an email last winter, saying he wasn't sure if what happened to him counted as a horror story, but that he hadn't slept right since it happened. He'd been hiking alone, somewhere along the Blue Ridge, on a section of trail that didn't get a lot of foot traffic in the colder months. He said the first day was uneventful, even peaceful, the kind of trip where you can hear your own heartbeat and the crunch of your boots becomes a steady rhythm that carries you forward. But on the second morning, something changed. He woke up just before dawn and found that the forest was completely silent. No birds, no wind, not even the usual drip of melting frost from the branches. He said it felt like the world was waiting for him to move, like every tree had turned its attention toward him. Eric packed up fast, shoved his gear into his bag, and started hiking back toward the trailhead. The silence followed him, so complete it made his ears ring. Around midday, he saw something up ahead, a person standing just off the trail. They were wearing what looked like a heavy coat, who'd pulled low, hands shoved into their pockets. Eric called out, just a simple "hey there," but the figure didn't respond, didn't move. He said something about the way they were standing, perfectly straight, made his stomach twist. So he kept walking, faster now, until he rounded a bend and lost sight of them. For a moment, he felt relief, until he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There, in the thin layer of frost on the ground, were footprints, fresh ones. They led from the spot where the figure had been standing, and then they led forward, along the trail, in the exact direction he was heading. The problem was, there were no prints leading to that spot. It was as if the figure had simply appeared out of nowhere, waited, then started walking ahead of him. Eric said he turned around right then, didn't care that it doubled his trip back. He said the silence broke only once, when he reached his car and heard a single branch snap behind him. Eric told me he never saw the figure again, but he said that single branch snap still echoes in his head at night. He sat in his car for nearly 20 minutes before he could even bring himself to turn the key, staring at the trailhead like something was going to step out of the trees. He said the strangest part was that when he finally drove off, he glanced in his rearview mirror and saw that same figure standing at the edge of the lot, just inside the tree line, perfectly still. He didn't stop, didn't slow down, didn't even blink until the first gas station on the highway. He didn't tell anyone for weeks, not because he was afraid they wouldn't believe him, but because he was afraid saying it out loud would make it real. He still hikes sometimes, but never alone, never in winter, and never on that section of trail again. What hit me about Eric's story wasn't just the figure or the footprints, it was the silence. That crushing, unnatural quiet that seems to mean something is there with you, just out of sight, just waiting. That's a common thread in so many of these Appalachian stories. People talk about hearing things, yes, but they talk just as often about hearing nothing. About the way the forest can go dead still, like it's holding something back, like it's giving you a chance to turn around before it's too late. And maybe that's the real warning, the thing we should all listen for. When you're out there and the woods go quiet, maybe it's not just nature taking a breath. Maybe it's the last kindness you're going to get. So if you're watching this right now, lights low, headphones in, remember this. Sometimes survival isn't about bravery. Sometimes it's about knowing when to leave, when to keep walking, when to trust the chill running down your spine. Because out there in the mountains, there are stories you won't get to tell if you wait too long to listen. And if you ever feel that silence pressing in on you, heavy and absolute, maybe the smartest thing you can do is turn back before you end up becoming the next story someone tells in a video like this. And that's the thing about these mountains, they're older than us, older than our roads and cabins and even our stories. People like to think they can tame them, carve out a little space for themselves, build a fire pit, maybe hang a string of lights and call it home for the weekend. But the mountains don't bend to us. They don't care how prepared you are, how expensive your gear is, or how strong your signal was when you left the last town. When you're out there, you're at their mercy, and sometimes they remind you of that in ways you can't shake. I think about that whenever I tell these stories, how many of them end the same way, with someone running for their car, looking over their shoulder, promising themselves they'll never go back. And some of them don't go back, but they also never stop looking. They keep replaying it in their heads, wondering what would have happened if they'd stayed just a little longer, taken one more step, waited one more minute. That's what makes these stories stick with you, the unanswered questions, the rope left tied too perfectly, the footprints that start but don't lead anywhere, the figure that stands too still. These details keep working their way into your mind until you start to notice things in your own life. A sound that doesn't belong, a shadow where there shouldn't be one, a silence that suddenly feels too deep. That's what I want you to take from this video. Not fear for the sake of fear, but respect. Respect for the places where the veil feels thinner, where the normal rules stop applying. If you ever go into the Appalachian backcountry, go with open eyes, but also go with caution. Bring someone with you. Stay on marked trails. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. And when you get that feeling that you're not alone, even when you can't see anyone, take it seriously. Because if there's one thing I've learned from collecting these stories, it's this: the mountain always wins. No matter how fast you drive away, no matter how many lights you leave on when you get home, a part of you will always be there, standing on that trail, listening to the silence, waiting for it to break. So as we close tonight's video, I want you to sit with that last image for a moment. You, standing on a lonely trail, the woods wrapped tight around you like a fist, the air too still, too quiet. That's where these stories leave us, right on the edge of something we're not supposed to see. The Appalachian Mountains have a way of humbling people, of reminding them that some places aren't meant to be fully understood. The disappearances, the unexplained sightings, the moments where time seems to stretch, they aren't just stories. They're warnings carried down through generations by those who made it out. And maybe that's why we can't stop telling them. While you're still here watching with the lights low and your heart beating a little faster than when we started. Because some part of us wants to believe we're safe as long as we keep the fire going, as long as we keep talking, as long as we keep watch. But when the fire dies, when the screen goes dark, when you're left with nothing but the sound of your own house settling, that's when the story really begins. So tonight, before you turn out the lights, take a second to listen. Not to the cars outside, not to the hum of your appliances, but to the spaces in between, to the silence. And if that silence suddenly feels too heavy, too close, maybe leave one light on. Maybe check that your doors are locked. And maybe, just maybe, don't look too long at the treeline outside your window. Because out there, in the dark, something might be standing perfectly still, waiting for you to notice. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the Appalachian Mountains and their disturbing true horror stories. This has been History's Dark Mirror, and I'll be back soon with more hidden and terrifying corners of the past. Until then, stay alert, stay careful, and whatever you do, don't ignore the silence.